So we spent this past Monday, students, in the library, and so we thought we would do a couple of conversations about the nature of sources that historians use. We'll come back to primary sources next week and talk about the kind of evidence historians use when you do original research, but we thought we'd start with the kind of sources you're actually doing in the library with your bibliography exercise, secondary, and also maybe a little bit on tertiary sources. I don't know if we spend a lot of time here, but what's the difference between a secondary and a tertiary source?
If I can answer that.
Oh, did I put you on the spot?
I guess when I think of a tertiary source, it's sort of like a clearinghouse or a warehouse of other sources that you can look at. So maybe.
Yeah, I only mention it because I think a question that often comes up in my classes, maybe in yours, is can we use Wikipedia? So I looked at Wikipedia and they define tertiary source as a kind of consolidation of other sources.
Like
so a synthesis that's usually much shorter, very accessible. Yeah, I guess I think of encyclopedia articles as the typical
like
tertiary
Encyclopedia
source.
Britannica or, I don't know. Yeah.
So maybe we can quickly address this Wikipedia question, which I don't know if you get this all the time too. I mean, what do you tell students when they say, can we use Wikipedia? Are there appropriate uses within the kind of undergraduate research they'll do, or what are inappropriate uses for it? How do you use Wikipedia as a history major or minor at Bethel?
I have used Wikipedia. So if I can use it, then obviously I think students can also use it. But I use it.
You can be hypocrites too, that's okay.
Well, no, I actually think that for me it's really useful in sort of seeing like what is the sort of popular consensus about the topic that I need to have a quick sort of overview of. And if it's a good Wikipedia source, it might actually have some bibliography at the end. That's actually very helpful in terms of now that I want something more reliable, here are places that I can start. So I use it for that.
I guess I tell students it's a place you can start, but it shouldn't be your ending point.
Right.
And they have hyperlinks to terminology, vocabulary, like the extra sources. Sometimes there's images. I think it can just be helpful to kind of get a grasp of, okay, get a handle on it. Where do I go from here? So as a starting point, as a launching pad, I think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same thing. I mean, I think an important skill actually is to learn how to read any source, but how to read, and that's one source you have to learn how to read, and there are ways to do it. I always tell students, especially if it's really important, like it's going to be a place that'll be a jumping off point for other research. There's a talk tab on any Wikipedia page. Click that to see what's been controversial about it, how it's been edited over time. If there's any kind of flagged neutrality question, that's where it'll tell you more.
See, that's the fun part.
That is the fun. That's the dirt that you got.
That's the nerdy.
So moving quickly then from tertiary to, I think the sources that students will be doing more work with, that they'll read in various forms in classes, secondary sources. I think a common point of confusion that I get from students is I'll tell them, well, I expect you to read academic monographs, scholarly works. And then they'll come back to me with something that's really clearly not academic. So what is the difference in your mind between an academic secondary source, whether it's a monograph or a collection of essays or a journal article, and maybe a more popular work of history that we would call a secondary source? How would you know that if you're a student looking at two different books side by side? How do you...
Well, we do that in my class. We talk about, what are the differences and how can we tell the difference. And so we kind of line them up and say, well, what do we see as different? And one of the things that students notice is one will have a lot of citations and one might just have a summary at the end. Typically, if you would read the material, you would notice in the scholarly secondary source that there's a scholarly conversation going on in the text. So that's another piece of evidence for it. So those are a couple of things that students look for. Are they peer reviewed? Can you find reviews of them? What types? Where are they being reviewed? How are they being reviewed? So those are some of the tips.
Yeah, and if you want like really pragmatic, sometimes, if you turn the book over and you look at the author sometimes will say, this person has a degree in history.
Right.
Usually historians write the more academic sources and journalists write the more popular things. Also, if it's an academic press, so if it's University of Oxford or if it's Random House, Random House is probably going to be the more popular versus the academic.
Right, and that's kind of the checklist we go through too, is the press that it is, who are the people who are commenting on the book. But there are good scholars who do popular history, like Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough. Some of those people do really good, solid work that can encourage the sort of popular reader to dig
Yep.
a little deeper.
Well, that maybe is the question. I mean, they both can be useful, right? It's not to say
Right.
popular history is bad
Yeah.
history.
Oh, no,
You have to
not at
think
all.
about what the purpose is you're using. And I think maybe if I can play the role of the student here, the difference I would notice would be footnotes or endnotes.
Yes.
Why do we have to put footnotes in our papers? What's the point of this? It seems like a lot of busy work. As a historian, why is that valuable to you that there are footnotes or endnotes, a bibliography? What is beneficial about that? Why do we make them do that discipline?
Well, I feel like that's the best part of the
I know,
book,
me too.
right?
I'm with Diana on this.
This is how you know a scholar.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
right, because you flip to the end, and there was just something that went around on the internet about how do you know a professional scholar from just a casual one. Is the professional scholar looks to the footnotes right
Yeah.
away to see, because that's students. One of my questions when we read, one of the reading questions is, what did you notice about the footnotes, and how is that instructive to you? And one of the things that students begin to notice is this conversation that's happening among scholars. They notice the type of evidence that the scholar is using across the semester. When you keep asking that question, we can then do comparative. What kinds of evidence is this historian using? How is that different from the ones who have come before? What might be missing? So you can have those kinds of conversations. So it's essential. I tell my students it's one of the tools that we use. And to not use that tool, to not have that in your toolbox, puts you at a disadvantage.
I think it's also just an act of scholarly courtesy, right? I sometimes tell students it's like leaving breadcrumbs for your research trail. I mean, like, why are you going to force your readers? I mean, if it's somebody who's
Right.
going to follow in your footsteps, why should you have to recreate all their research? I mean, it gives them a jumping off point to continue the conversation, to go back to that source. Maybe it sparks a different line of inquiry. And it's because it's the kind of agreed upon set of standards of how you write it. It's an easy language we all share. And not doing that is almost like, well, you go do the same work I just did all over again, and then you get to do your work.
Well, and I think it points to the integrity of the discipline aspect of telling the story is, we don't have experiments in a room that, can be replicated in the same way, but our footnotes are one way that we say, yes, in fact, you can go and read the stuff and you will see the
You
stuff
could
that I'm saying.
redo this.
You could.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And so I think that, it's not like anybody necessarily would do that, but I think it speaks to that we are being faithful to the discipline as well as telling the story.
So another tricky term, I think, for even history majors is historiography. My own experience was I didn't really encounter it probably until graduate school. Even having done kind of an independent senior thesis, I probably couldn't have told you what that is. So first, definition, what is historiography, if we use that term?
Well, there's a boring one, but maybe Diana, I'm going to give Diana this one.
Well, I don't know,
No
but
pressure.
I when I talk about it with my students, I really think of it as in a threefold way. Historiography is the body of work, so the body of, say we're looking at, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but
History of slavery?
history of slavery. So that body of literature would be its historiography. Historiography is also the act of creating that work. And I can't think of my third thing.
Well, to a certain
off the top of my head,
extent, I sometimes say it's the history of the
the
history.
history of the history.
Or where
Yes,
it
that's
comes
what I.
the boring one.
That's
but
the
yeah.
boring one,
Thank
but it tells a great
Sorry.
story.
That's okay.
And I do historiographies in my class. With each unit, I'll do an historiography of slavery, and historiography of the early republic, and historiography of the Civil War, and historiography of Reconstruction. And in and of itself, historiography is fascinating.
Yeah,
It's
that's
a
true. I
fascinating
agree.
story. And one of the dreams that I have, I tell my students I have these weird fantasies, and one fantasy is that at the end of the semester is to throw a pile of books in the middle of the room and to have students put them in order, because you could tell that historiographic story. How are they? What kinds of questions are they asking? What sorts of evidence do they have? Are they all male scholars?
Right.
Yeah.
Are there So those I think historiography is just so cool, and it's really interesting.
Well, I think it's helpful for students to see that even the great historians are influenced by the time that they
Right.
lived in. And so they tell the story differently from somebody who comes 50 years later and is influenced by now, talking about, say, history of slavery, is influenced by the civil rights movement and is
Right,
writing about
right.
things very differently.
Yeah, I say they're not historian. We aren't writing in a vacuum. We
Right.
might be writing in, a room with a naked light bulb hanging from the ceiling, but you are the kinds
Yeah.
of questions that you ask are driven by your time period, not the period that you're looking at.
It makes
the
sense. I mean, if
person.
one
Yeah.
of the hallmarks of historical thinking is attention to context. Makes sense.
Yeah,
We want
you
to pay
have to.
attention. There's no view from nowhere when you write
Right,
history.
and that's one of the questions, the reading questions I have for students is, what is the context of this historian? Who are they? What time period? What is their pedigree? What schools did they go to? Who were their, teachers?
I think it's also an important reminder. I talked to scientists enough to know that one thing they really value is the sense that they're a part of a community. That they're not solely responsible for the work they're building on others. They're in conversation with others, and I don't know how we keep talking about whether history is a science, but I think there's some of that you get when you do historiography. But it also gets us to this idea that, Diana, you've mentioned already, of a scholarly conversation. And I think this, even in senior seminar when I've taught, is sometimes hard even for experienced majors to pick up. And what is the conversation? What are the stakes? What are the questions? What are the debates? So you've started to talk about this, that the footnotes is often where you find that. But I mean, if you're talking even to entering students, we might tell them, start to think about what is the nature of that conversation, what advice can you give them to discern that, so they can know what historians are talking about, what they're debating, where you see that change in interpretation over time.
Well, and there are different places you can see that conversation. We talk about, how does that conversation develop, and why read scholarly journals, why read popular work, why read blogs, right? So you post on your blog, that can happen weekly. You can update it, after we have this conversation. But a journal article has to be vetted. It might be 6 or 8 months before that conversation then turns over, and a book might be even longer. So those are, there's different ways in which you can enter that scholarly debate.
And sometimes journals will publish review essays. I mean, that's the shortcut.
Right,
Sometimes
the
they'll
shortcut,
actually say, it's been a while since we've checked in on the
Right.
state of the field. Let's review a certain number of major works that have been done recently.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think if students pay close attention, especially to the introductions of books and the first few paragraphs of an article, you can see that again reflected in the footnotes, that here is where they're engaging the conversation and saying, and this is what I'm hoping to add to the conversation, having sort of demonstrated that I know the conversation.
And here's why I think it's hard even for our best students, is because we don't live in a culture that likes to read anymore. And our discipline requires it of us, and it requires a level of precision and care and commitment that I don't think our culture is developing in even our best students. And so you can't quickly get abreast of things. You do have to invest a little bit of time.
And I think, to harken back to something we've talked about in an earlier conversation, history is not just the accretion of facts. And I think sometimes we're conditioned to read as if this is just done for information. And I think that's one reason sometimes I see students having a hard time, is they're just looking, and it seems on that level they all agree. They're all saying the same dates, the same people, but if you understand history is also an act of interpretation, or it's an argument in some fashion, you've got to be looking for that argument, and that's where you'll actually see the conversation maybe coming into relief, not necessarily the facts, the information. One final question here, practical bits of advice. Students are working on a bibliography exercise where they have to pick a topic that interests them in some field in history and develop a list of especially secondary sources and annotate it. So we'll do a little bit of this in the library. What advice would you have for students as they start to venture out into at least secondary source level historical research? What are some things you use when you're first starting a project and trying to build a list of things that you know you need to read?
Well, the easiest thing to do, since we are a small department, is to go talk to your professors, right? Diana knows everything there is to know about colonial 19th American Civil War history, to say women's history and numerous other things. So talk to Diana, talk to Chris, talk to Amy, talk to us, and give us, a sense of what you want to do, and we can probably give you a couple of authors to start with. Those authors will then lead you to the other authors, and so on and so forth.
There you go. Yep.
And also textbooks are really helpful too. So if you're interested in Reconstruction, look at the Reconstruction chapter in an American history textbook. There's usually some sort of, for further reading, check out these sources. That's easy. That's an easy place to get started. And then obviously use the reference library.
Right, I was going to say make friends with the reference librarian. They live for that.
They're easy to make friends with.
Okay, thanks very much.